everybody. Thank you for joining us today in this Sunday. My name is Daniela Lieja Quintanar, and I'm Chief Curator and Director of Programming at LACE, Los Angeles Contemporary Exhibitions. And first, I want to acknowledge that I am speaking, and also LACE is in unceded Tongva territory. LACE is located in what is now known as Hollywood. And right now, our gallery is under renovations, but we are still doing a lot of programming like this. We are also working with different organizations around Los Angeles. So I'll invite you, if you are not in our newsletters or you are not following us, join us in welcome-to-lace.org. And right now we have a show at MOLA, the Museum of Latin America in Long Beach, called Dream Team by Salvadorian artist Craig Rodriguez. So if you have a chance to go there, please visit until June 2027. Also, we have an open call of our Emerging Curators program that is closing soon in June 26. So if you are interested in curating, this is a good opportunity to work with LACE. And today we are thrilled to have our special guest speakers, Bhavna Shamasunder and Sandy Navarro. Thank you for being with us. And this talk is part of a bigger project called Undisciplinary Tactics. Beatriz da Costa is a project that I'm curating with a big group of people and that are helping in advice and in doing the research. This project is part of the Getty initiative, Pacific Standard Time, that is going to happen in 2024, and the theme is art and science. And we're going to present this exhibition at the renovated LACE in 2024. Undisciplinary Tactics revisits the collaborative artistic practice of the late Beatriz da Costa, whose inter and undisciplinary work focused on public science, environmental issues in connection with health public. And this project also looks to engage with other collective efforts around social justice, autonomous models to obtain information for communities in risk, like the project that we are going to hear today. And as I mentioned, in inspiration of the work of Da Costa, that it was very collaborative, we have a research team, and we have different artists and curators collaborating with us. And today we have Andrew McNeely, who is a curator, writer, and editor, and founder of the community reading group at LACA. He is working with us as curatorial advisor, and he has been working in the research since the beginning. And he organized this talk and also coordinates the Preemptive Study group, a collective space of thinking and studying the artistic practice of Da Costa. And thank you to the people of the study group that is here present with us. If you want to learn more about Beatriz, I recommend to go to our YouTube channel. We have a previous talk that we expand more in her life and artistic practice. And and finally, I want to thank you to Ana Briz, who is our curatorial assistant of the project, and the LACE team, of course, Juan Silverio, our exhibition manager, Brenna Perry, the communications coordinator, and our executive director, Sarah Rosin, that are here with us. Thank you, and I'm just gonna pass, Andrew is gonna introduce Bhavna and Sandy, and then we're gonna have a space for discussion. Thank you everybody for being here.
Thank you, Daniela. So very quickly, again, my name is Andrew McNeely. I'm a writer, editor, and curator, and I'm also a curatorial advisor to the exhibition that Daniela is currently developing with Anna. A part of the research phase of this exhibition is a collective study group that you are now all currently in. This is one of our capstone talks for the first phase of this research project. The research phase, of this project is what I should say. And I just want to talk briefly about some of the questions that we've been pursuing in this group as it relates to the life and work of Beatriz da Costa. Beatriz da Costa is an artist who explored the intersection of artistic practice and scientific research throughout her life's work, and wrote extensively about what it meant to bring the arts to science and what it meant to practice scientific research outside of the university. And one of the ways that I want to think about the relationship of the arts to science in tandem with the work that Sandy and Bhavna are doing that we're going to dive into is thinking about questions of what it means to make science public, which will be a recurrent theme that I will bring up over the course of this talk. But some of the other questions that we've pursued have to do with regarding questions such as, should the arts play a role in scientific research? As I just said, should science's influence on public life be subject to more democratic deliberation? And how might the concerns and interests of lay people be more meaningfully included in furthering scientific knowledge? So one could think about another big question of this group, in addition to what does it mean to make science public, is what should be the relationship of scientific expertise to members of, or to community members who may not necessarily see themselves as quote unquote experts, but have a lot to offer to scientific study. The specific focus of today's talk is what is called community-based participatory research. And in brief, community-based participatory research is a partnership approach to research that equitably involves community members, organizational representatives, researchers, and others in all aspects of the research process, with all the partners in the process contributing expertise and sharing in the decision-making and ownership of scientific research. And the two guests that we have today, Sandy Navarro and Bhavna Shamasunder, are practitioners of this model or methodology of public health research. So with that said, I would like to briefly introduce our two guests. So Sandy Navarro is a lifelong resident of historic South Central Los Angeles, whose firsthand experience of living in a disenfranchised community galvanized her commitment to social justice work. In 2014, Sandy joined the staff of Esperanza Community Housing, overseeing multiple community-led beautification projects and health-driven collaborations throughout South Los Angeles. While at Esperanza, Sandy managed the environmental justice campaign People Not Pozos, People Not Oil Wells, served on the Stand Together Against Neighborhood Oil Drilling, or Stand LA, coalition, and led local youth leaders in the formation of the South Central Youth Leadership Coalition. In 2017, Sandy launched LA Grit Media, an agency dedicated to working collaboratively with organizations, researchers, and public health groups to produce community-driven media and advance community-based research. Sandy has produced educational videos, designed health literacy intervention materials, and created art exhibitions for Esperanza Community Housing, Occidental College, USC Environmental Health Centers, Iris Cantor UCLA Women's Health Center, and the Los Angeles County Department of Public Health. A graphic designer, videographer, and community health promoter, Sandy Navarro utilizes her skills to bring visibility to the social issues in her community. Now, pivoting to Bhavna Shamasunder. Bhavna is Associate Professor and Chair in the Urban Environmental Policy Department and co-chair of the Public Health Program at Occidental College. She teaches and conducts research on environmental health and justice with a focus on the disparate and cumulative burdens faced by poor communities of color. Her active research projects include health impacts from neighborhood oil drilling in Los Angeles, the quote, environmental justice of beauty, unquote, that considers health disparities for women of color from synthetic chemicals in consumer products and the types of information, in essence, economic, public health, et cetera, used by diverse immigrant communities in decisions to lighten skin and or use skin lightening products. Her work has been supported by the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, the California Breast Cancer Research Program, and the National Science Foundation. She received her doctorate from the University of California, Berkeley in the Department of Environmental Science, Policy, and Management. So with that, everyone please join me in welcoming our guests, Bhavna and Sandy.
Awesome, Andrew. Thank you so much for the invitation. Yeah, so I guess, we have a presentation prepared for you all. I'll probably start and then Bhavna will continue. But, first of all, we just want to say thank you for having us here. We really appreciate every opportunity to highlight our community work, to highlight the issues that impact us most, and to, really, create dialogue around some of the solutions, that we hope to find. And so I'm gonna share my screen to begin with the presentation, but unless Bhavna wants to say anything before we begin.
No, I'm good. Go ahead, and then let's switch to my computer.
Okay, cool. Alrighty. So like Andrew mentioned, I'm a community health worker from South Los Angeles. I, lived there my entire life. And, I really want to just, kind of share my story as far as how I became, a community organizer and then just a community researcher, and how I met Bhavna and how we've really worked together to complement each other's work and goals. And then also how I've used art to amplify, the issues impacting our communities. And so, I really want to go back to, I guess, almost a decade ago. And like I mentioned, I am from South Central, and when I was in college, at Mount St. Mary's, now it's Mount St. Mary's University, it used to be Mount St. Mary's College, I learned about an oil drilling site that was right in our neighborhood. And, that's kind of like when I started hearing about what was going on, that I got involved with Esperanza Community Housing. And just to give folks an idea about the oil drilling in communities like South LA and the proximity to, sensitive populations, I want to show this graphic here. Like, this is the Alenco drill site that's on 23rd Street and St. James. And you can see, that you have affordable housing buildings that are owned by Esperanza Community Housing right across the street. You have Mount St. Mary's College right next to it. And then you have a high school for children with special needs. And, really, this is a community that, like I said, it's a densely populated community. So, you have folks going to school, living there or playing there right next to a drill site. And like I said, I lived there my entire life and went to elementary school there, went to college there. And it wasn't until I was in college that I learned about the drilling happening in our neighborhood. But I always remember driving by and smelling gas, and then realizing that, there's something wrong here. And it wasn't until like my 20s that I was like, oh, wow, there's an oil drilling. And that's kind of really what got me into like the organizing. And let's see, go to the next slide. Okay, and then this is what the oil drilling site looks like from the exterior. A lot of these sites look the same. There's like just like this very little signage. The facilities are often like well manicured. Something that we talk about is that there's this lack of green spaces in communities like South Central. And so I've had friends who used to tell me, I used to have picnics there with my children, because it was like the only green space. But little did we know that this was actually a drilling site. And the picture on the right is actually Mount St. Mary's College. You can see again the proximity to the oil drilling facility. And then this is a shot that I took, you know, from on top of one of Esperanza's buildings, affordable housing buildings. Again, you see how close this site is. And that's something that I've always done. I don't know why, you know, I've always carried my camera. So aside from organizing and trying to mobilize folks, I've always felt like there was like this need to document the entire movement and, you know, document our stories. And so, yeah, and then later we'll talk about like what I've done with that footage. But it's something that, you know, somehow I just always felt like, you know, I really need to carry my camera and really capture what's going on in our neighborhoods, capture the people that are trying to move this movement forward. And so, like I mentioned, like this was in 2010, 2011, when some residents that lived in the Esperanza affordable housing building started complaining of these symptoms, you know, and the symptoms were, again, like, you know, asthma, headaches, nosebleeds. And, you know, and so we were hearing about people complaining, and people were started calling AQMD, the Air Quality Management District. And, you know, they were being told that they needed to have, I don't know, like over 20 people to call within 1 hour in order for them to actually come out to the site to see what was going on. And I think when you think about the type of community that South Central is, a lot of the times you have people who are monolingual Spanish speaking, you have people who are hardworking, you have people who are busy, and, you know, to have, you know, over 20 people call within the same hour in order for them to come out and respond to, you know, the complaints is just ridiculous, you know. And so it really, you know, I think Esperanza was documenting a lot of the complaints, and unfortunately, you know, it just fell on deaf ears. But these were some of the things that we were seeing in the neighborhood. And, you know, I do want to highlight the picture on the right, because that's one of the residents that lives there. And I remember this was like maybe 10 years ago that we took this photo. This is where I really start thinking about how storytelling and photos and art and imagery just really help, you know, amplify a message. You know, the picture on the right, I remember that day vividly. We had a reporter from the LA Times come out to do a story on our community, and we were telling her about the nosebleeds. And when she came out, you know, she snapped this photo of this kid, and he, you know, when she was interviewing the parents, this kid started having a spontaneous nosebleed, and she captured that, and that image landed on the LA Times. And I think that was like probably the image that really caught people's attention. And so again, art, it has always been important, at least for the oil drilling movement, I think, you know, for our campaigns. And, you know, I actually go back because I really remember also about like the importance of having community members control their narrative. You know, when we were first organizing, we were so new to this. We were very green to like the oil drilling movement and what was going on. And I recall, you know, folks telling us, you know, you have to talk about fracking, you have to talk about the environment. But when you think about a community that's more focused on just, you know, having affordable housing, on making a living, on taking care of the kids, that narrative wasn't really resonating with folks. And in fact, you know, there wasn't fracking happening at the Allen Cole site. So, you know, we as a group, as a community group, thought, you know, like, our message is always going to be about health. Our focus is about the health and well-being of our neighborhood. And that's the way we were able to reach residents, engage them in conversations. And I think it was what really caught people's attention. The fact that we were humanizing this issue, because it's a violation of human rights. And so, you know, like I always say, I'm not a scientist, I'm a community organizer. And for us, really focusing on the health impacts was something that I think helped us, you know, move our campaign forward. And our campaign was People Not Pozos. And this was you know, meaning people, not oil wells. And we did a banner drop right in front of the Allen Cole drill site. And this is one of Esperanza's affordable housing buildings. We did a banner drop. And again, I painted this banner with the community residents. And I think this was the beginning where I started, like, you know, dabbling in art and really using art to, you know, I think, you know, I guess get people's attention, you know, using art to like build awareness, using art to spark dialogue and then inspire action. And so this is a banner drop we did a long time ago. We also used these heads that were made out of foam, you know, and we drew like nosebleeds on them. And I think this is what I found, that I guess this is the reason why I felt like a connection to Beatriz's work is using art to really spark conversations, to spark action. And then, so like I said, when that article came out, we got the attention of former Senator Barbara Boxer, and she came out to our neighborhood. She did like this speech in front of the building, and then finally we started seeing some movement, you know. I think based on that visit, shortly after the Allen Cole drill site decided to like close or to stop its operations. And so it was like this victory for our community. It wasn't, you know, like, you know, of course we wanted the site to close, but at least, you know, they stopped their operations and they were finally being investigated, which I think, you know, as with any movement, it takes sometimes decades, like in the oil drilling work. And so those incremental victories have always helped our people stay motivated. And so you can see that the air quality management district, you know, there were so many complaints, over 200, I guess 260 odor and air complaints that were filed. Although I believe Esperanza has attract more than that. And so next I want to go into like Stand LA Coalition. I'll briefly talk about this, but you know, from us starting as this small community group that was trying to mobilize as residents, we were able to, you know, connect with other communities like in Wilmington who were experiencing the same thing and doing the same work and have been doing the same work for so many years. And we were able to form the Stand Together Against Neighborhood Oil Drilling Coalition. And this is really a coalition of several organizations like PSRLA, Communities for a Better Environment, Scope. And I think the beauty of coalitions, even though, you know, I think if people, as I think any organizer would tell you that they're probably exhausted by the amount of coalitions they have to be part of. But I think this is the beauty of coalitions, is that everyone brings their strengths to the table. Everyone has an expertise that they can offer to move this campaigns forward. And so with Stand LA, you know, you have Communities for a Better Environment who have, you know, researchers, who have attorneys. And then, you know, through this work, we were able to connect with Bhavna, and that's really how my connection and my introduction to community-based research happened. You know, and through this coalition work and through meeting Bhavna, we were really, I think, able to leverage what we knew, our expertise and her expertise, to start, you know, really getting data around the health impacts in our community. And you know, like I said, this was like really the introduction with you know, Bhavna and her students. You know, we did an oil drilling study, and Bhavna will talk about this more in depth later, but I just wanted to say how it was through this community organizing work that I was introduced to Bhavna. You know, like I said, I went to film school, I'm an organizer, so science was just like not on my radar. But, you know, Bhavna really, you know, came out, and I think, you know, not only trained us in how to conduct health surveys, but I think she's always like, been very sensitive to, like, you know, or respecting, or has good ethics when it comes to research. And I think it's super important, you know, that researchers will come onto their neighborhoods, that it is a collaborative process, and that the data always gets reported back. And you'll be able to see that through the work that she's done, you know, that we've done, how this work comes back to the community. Because like I said, like in working with Bhavna, and my role has always been to organize, to connect with folks, to get the Promotora network involved, and to, you know, present. And I've like I tell Bhavna, you know, I make presentations, and people will tell me like, hey, you know, like, you know, don't just be coming here with your surveys, you know, we want to make sure that this data comes back to our neighborhood. And that's something that Bhavna does do with her work. And so, you know, like I said, this is the first study that we did with Bhavna and her students. And we went out to 2 sites. We surveyed the Allen Cole community. So, and that site was actually closed. And then we also surveyed the community near the Jefferson drill site. And then that led to other studies where we were able to, you know, place air monitors. And again, Bhavna will go into the research and the data behind this. But, you know, like you can see in the picture on the left, that was an air quality monitor that was placed, you know, through a collaboration with Occidental College, USC, and the University of Colorado Boulder. And you can see the air quality management district's a monitor that was placed on top of our one of the buildings. And you can see the lack of accountability, or just, I don't know, it, you know, it took us a very long time to even get an AQMD monitor. And then it toppled over. And, you know, that data, I don't recall them ever sharing that data. And if it was accessible, you got to remember that I think a lot of people don't even know how to access these platforms, you know. And then you have on the right, we have local youth that we were engaging throughout the process, where they were learning about these low cost air quality sensors, and then they were helping us place them around the neighborhood. Let's see, and then, you know, again, Bhavna will talk about the second study with USC as well, where we did like spirometry measurements, and you know, but again, the people really working alongside the researchers are promotoras. These are promotoras and promotores. These are people who live in the neighborhood, who know the neighborhood, who are trusted by community members. And I think that's one of the biggest reasons why we're able to accomplish what we do. You know, in the second survey, we actually, I think, surveyed like over 500 folks in the neighborhood. And I think without the promotora network, without that trust, we probably wouldn't be able to reach those numbers, you know. Let me see what's next. Yeah, so I think that's kind of like my part. I don't know if I went too fast, but if you guys have any questions as far as like this particular section, and then we'll get into her presentation. But again, I just wanted to share how, you know, as you know, I became a concerned resident, to a community organizer, to a community researcher, and then in using my art to really, you know, I guess have some report back, using my art to build awareness, and using the art to like really spark action. So I think I'll stop there for now, and then before Bhavna proceeds, I can take any questions if you have any.
Beautiful, Sandy. Thank you so much for that.
And if you want to keep your slides, and I will just follow on from you.
Sure. Sure.
So I think that this work is really, I guess, Andrew, did you want to take questions first, and then I'll transition and I'll do it at the end?
Well, I should, is there anyone with pressing questions that may be best to leave toward the end? I certainly have some questions, but I'll reserve them for the end.
Okay. Any pressing questions before I go?
I'm sensing no.
Okay.
Oh, wait, we have someone from the chat.
What's the status? You know, it closed down in, well, it didn't close. Let's see, they're no longer operating at the moment, but they're not fully closed. So they were shut down by the city, and they have not opened up again. And the idea is that things don't stay closed. But, you know, I think it's maybe that's a good way to think about kind of LA as a whole. And so I just maybe want to do a little bit of work situating where my research comes from and how I do my work. So I'm trained as an environmental justice scholar, and my work really is informed by three big kind of disciplines. So environmental justice, which has really thought about you know, and traveled a lot of work on ground since the 1980s. I don't really think about my work in disciplinary silos. I'm sort of a social scientist. I'm also a scientist. I do work across fields, and you know, environmental justice was started in the 1980s of thinking around disproportionate impacts faced by communities of color to hazardous sites. Really was struggle as an extension of civil rights organizing, and that's how we think about it. It's not sort of an extension of the environmental movement, but really it's a racial justice movement. And the environmental justice movement and the work that kind of came before us informs how we think about the work we do. The environmental health sciences has a history of really measuring pretty downstream health impacts. So they measure illness, diabetes, heart disease, asthma, and says who has it. This was not a super compelling model for me as a student. And so I don't have a doctorate in public health. My doctorate is in environmental science and policy, because I think that I'm interested in upstream thinking, but there are environmental health scholars that are increasingly thinking about systemic factors that affect health, so such as racism. And so I would situate myself with their work. And And then Beatriz da Costa, I think she would fall under STS, Science and Technology Studies, and is published in that field. And I have some of her writing, and I think really has elaborated how technologies of science, how do they become embedded in culture, and how do they even propel forward kind of things like racial kind of ideas, and how does science itself make these decisions that might seem really invisible, that are actually kind of racialized understandings of the world, but are hidden behind technology, or hidden behind kind of methods like risk assessment that we use in deciding whether there's harm in the community. So I'm really interested in unpacking a lot of that, and I think Beatriz da Costa's work really is in that vein. So we're really excited to work with this group that's thinking kind of extensively about these questions. Next slide. So my work really is empirical and grounded in place. So while there are the really big theories that guide work, we really think about work in place, and scholarship and community-based research can cross lots of disciplines. So environmental justice, urban planning, community-driven epidemiology. There's a 3 R's work that Rachel Morello-Frosch and Carolina Balzac has written that was in the reading list for this group. And so there's lots of scholars thinking about how do you do research thoughtfully, how do you involve communities in the research design, what does that mean, and what are the best methods for doing this. And one of the things that is most important to me, next slide, is really central, is actually thinking about the co-production of knowledge and power. And so not all community-based research is the same. Lots of people say they do this work, and I think it's become more of a buzzword and more popular. And I'm really interested in thinking about shifting power structures in research, and how do you share the research design funding, how we create the questions. Those are all really important. Some communities don't want to be involved in all the really, some of the data analysis stuff that might be really, intensive, but they want access. So having really thoughtful conversations at the front end before you start any project. But the thing that I think is most important is that the data is fully owned. At the end of a project, it must be at the disposal of the community. And unlike, I think, a lot of scientists, I really actually think that being a scientist and a scholar means you should take sides, and not all, and there is no, the idea of this objective knowledge that some can relay doesn't really acknowledge kind of the power dynamics that are embedded in science that are invisible. So we do try to transform every way that we do our research. So from all the way from the sampling methods to peer review, how we run our lab groups, how we train students, how we pay our community partners. So that's my hope. It's a long journey. It doesn't work all the time, but it's sort of the goal, the larger goal of the work. Next slide. So as I said, our work is really grounded in place. Our site is Los Angeles, and LA is a big city. It's a city of 4 million people, 10 million in the county. Next slide. So what's really important about South Los Angeles is that it's recognized by the state of California as an environmental justice community. So this is a picture from Cal Environment Screen, which is a state of California tool that was fought for really hard by environmental justice organizations. And it basically compiles environmental hazards and social and economic burdens. And it makes a color-coded map, and you can go to Cal Environment Screen and look at your own neighborhood. And South LA is in the top 5% of the most heavily burdened communities in the state. So it has a disproportionate share of pollution burden, and it's a majority minority area of LA where a greater proportion of residents live below the poverty line than in the city overall. And so, next slide. So LA is the largest urban oil field in the country, and it's had continuous drilling for over a century. So this is LA in the 1920s, and while I won't tell the story here of how this 100 years of drilling came to be, I've written about it in book chapters and articles. I'll note that it's a practice that's been allowed. The city has been permitted it, And they have created these special oil standard district zones that sit on top of residential areas. And oil drilling operates much closer to homes, schools, hospitals, and other vulnerable sites than it does in other places. And there are no setbacks or buffers required at all in the city. So next slide. So the oil industry has worked pretty hard to operate by hiding in plain sight. And they do this, as Sandy noted, by building tall hedges, planting landscape gardens in front of no trespassing gates. And in nearby Long Beach is the top left picture. In 1965, they hired a famed Disney architect, a Disney park architect, to design Thumbs Island, which stands for Texaco Humboldt, which is now Exxon, Union Mobile, and Shell. And it's a set of 4 artificial islands built in camouflage roads with landscaping, waterfalls, and tall structures. And its job is to hide from view 42 acres of oil fields and 1,100 wells in a vast underground oil field. And so the industry has also funded public parks and other voluntary efforts that are really aimed to marshal public support and to deflect efforts at regulatory control. Next slide. So residents are often living by fields and they're not aware that they're there. So 20,000 active, idle, or abandoned oil wells are spread across 10 million people. In the county, 1/3 of residents live less than a mile from an active well, and some right next door. And so, and while oil drilling is everywhere in LA, wells in communities of color are closer to residents, have less enforcement, have open air extraction versus behind protected facades. Next slide. So this is some of the work that Stand LA began to do through our first do a report called Drilling Down. You can still find the report on the Liberty Hill Foundation's website. The Liberty Hill Foundation funded an early report to try to think about what's in LA. So we documented kind of this landscape of drilling. There are 5,000 wells, and you know, how many people, how many are in the city, how many are in the county. And we started trying to do some of the visuals that would communicate this messaging. And so this was an early part of our work. Next slide. And so we know from research on oil and gas extraction all over the country, there's a lot of research, thousands of studies on oil and gas. And we know that oil drilling worsens air pollution, that's local, and it emits toxic compounds, including methane and particulate matter, and these have known health impacts. And I'm not going to talk about that a lot here, but it's, you know, it adds to air pollution, which is a concern in Los Angeles. Next slide. And its extraction in some neighborhoods ramped up in LA. This is across the Los Angeles area. People living in South LA, as Sandy noted, and other areas started noticing these problems. They noted odors, nosebleeds, headaches. And near the Allen Coast site, which Sandy talked about in 2014, oil drilling went up 400% in 1 year. And so that was the cause of a lot of the problems. Next slide. So since the 2000s, there's been an advance of extractive technologies that are really trying to get at harder to reach deposits. And so in the last decade or so, 9 years, this has led to this resurgence of oil activity. And this is what the wells look like. So there's a well operating right next to a house, and this boy walking with his backpack in front of it. They don't know it's there. And if you sit in and you know, when there's workers in this field, they'll be wearing hazmat suits, but the kid in the second story of that house doesn't have any protective gear. So these are the communities that we have focused on. Next slide. And so in partnership with residents over the 7 years, we conducted 2 studies, and I'm going to go through this quickly. So one was on a really emergency shoestring budget that $11 project gave us, and it was in the wake ratcheted up production. And the second, the first study allowed us to get funded by the National Institutes of Environmental Health Sciences. So the second was we did on the heels of the first study. So our methods are grounded and community-based. We worked with promotoras in the community, community health workers. The Allen Coast site where we worked is 75 Latinx, and the Murphys and the Jefferson sites, which are also in South, have a mix of Black, Latinx, and Korean residents who worked in multiple languages. Near the Murphys and Jefferson sites, we worked with Redeemer Community Partnerships, which is a church-based organizing group. In the first study, we trained our research team in human subjects, survey methods, and by the second study, they were trained in how to take lung function measures and sample collection methods. We pilot every instrument in the community and with the community organization before we do broader outreach with residents. Next slide. So South LA, as I mentioned, has more residents of color than the rest of the city, more Black residents, more Latinx residents, a greater percentage of residents with less than a high school education, and significantly more residents living 200% or more below the poverty line, and a greater percentage of renters versus owners. This is important because in LA we have split estates. We also have, just because you live somewhere doesn't mean you own the mineral rights. But if you do own your mineral rights, you get a cut of the profits. If you're a renter, you're not seeing those at all. Next slide. So here's a well. It's a little hard to see, but you'll see that these are the two wells from our first study, and you'll see where they are with the Cal-Enviro Screen Burden Score, which is the red. And it's just a way for you to kind of contextualize where we are in space. Next slide. And so we conducted focus groups with our residents also to ask them kind of what their experiences are. And residents face multiple and cumulative stressors from living in these neighborhoods. And this includes things like homelessness, persistent dumping, a lack of services, worrying about their children, air quality smells, anti-Black racism that was both demonstrated by Latinx participants and felt by Black residents, and demonstrated by people living in the neighborhood. But Black residents really felt it. The graph shows some of the descriptions of experiences. And as residents struggle to navigate these different concerns, oil drilling is really just one of these many concerns faced by daily life. Next slide. So our work really is in partnership with community. And so it's the Stand LA Coalition that Sandy was a part of, and is a coalition of frontline community organizations rooted in LA. So LA has this very long and sophisticated history of organizing. And organizations that helm Stand are really at the front line of kind of thoughtful and really strategic organizing. And Stand LA made two really important moves that made our work stronger. They created a coalition of frontline EJ organizations that live nearby drilling. There were big green organizations that wanted to connect oil drilling to climate and fracking, as Sandy mentioned, but while they allowed it support from these outside groups, they really focused on being frontline resident-led and thus would not dilute their message. They had a really clear public health and racial justice message. The wells were in making their community sick. They were located where they live, work, and play. And it's with this coalition of groups that we work. And we've attended numerous bus tours with decision makers, given talks, coordinated public comments, and we align our research with the goals of public health protection and their organizing. Next slide. So they noted racial disparities in enforcement, in landscaping, in emissions control, and well by well they organized. They organized the city and the county, they organized with political actors in the city, and they organized neighborhood by neighborhood. Next slide. So in the study one, so our studies in the winter and spring of 2015, we surveyed 203 households representing 803 residents nearby 2 wells in South LA. So these were residents living about 1,500 feet from a well. It was a community responsive survey. So despite 100 years of drilling in LA, there is absolutely no data in LA. There was, and this survey was self-reported health knowledge of the field and whether they knew a field there was there or not. So when people self-reported their health, we found that asthma was much more significant among residents living near oil wells we surveyed than among LA as a whole. 45% of people didn't know the well was there, the field was there, and 63% had no idea who to contact if they smelled something or had a health effect. By the time we did study 2, we had National Institutes of Health funding, and we were able to apply for a larger round from the data from the first work, and we used a community-based epidemiological design. And in this, we actually measured lung function. So we had a quote unquote objective measure using a spirometer, which you breathe into this tube and it measures your lung function, how much you exhale. And we did, and we measured 961 participants from 488 households, 30% children and 20% were older than 60. And we did this in 3 languages, English, Spanish, and Korean. And most of the people had lived in the neighborhood for more than 10 years. And our promotoras were trained into, again, in all of the sample collection. And we recruited people at elementary schools, churches, door to door, and neighborhood meetups. Next slide. And so what we found that living near an urban oil drilling site is significantly associated with reduced lung function. So you might recall that in the first study where people self-reported their health, they said they had more asthma, but this was this objective measure where we can see reduced lung function through this measurement. We found that distance matters, proximity is associated with lower lung function, and people who lived close and downwind had a stronger effect, and the pattern persisted by neighborhood. So by this time, Alco had been shuttered because of community activism, but the effect on lung function persists. Next slide. But the punchline, I think, of this story and its policy relevance is that 9 years of efforts led to 2 big political victories. Last September, the County Board of Supervisors unanimously passed a motion to phase out oil and gas drilling in county jurisdictions, and early this year, the LA City Council passed a 14-0 motion to write an ordinance that would make oil drilling a non-conforming land use. There's still a really long road ahead, but this is a really big political win, given that oil drilling was really adopted by political decision makers for a very long time in LA. So in these ordinances, they've relied on our research, our survey paper and our lung function paper are the only 2 studies in LA on oil extraction. The second paper on lung function that came out last year is cited in the county motions. Organizers have noted this research was important in the campaign. The lived experience from the first study, unfortunately, didn't push the policy conversation quite far enough. The EPI study mattered, and power in the context of an organized base that knew how to leverage the EPI data. There's lots of EPI studies that just sit on a shelf somewhere, and Stand LA knew how to use our research to kind of move their agenda. So we think that when strategic research is aligned with organizing, really can push political levers, and it's much more difficult one without the other, since there's always politicians who want scientific cover. And when there's data, it provides that. And on the other side, Stand has really succeeded in focusing on an EJ agenda. And we're going to be continuing this work over the next several years in a couple of sites in South LA. And so if you're interested in this work, please reach out. Next slide. So the lessons in threads of this, of our work are really that the lack of data is often posed as a no problem. Just because there's no data, people say that there's no problem, but really that's not true. And it's just no data. And so it's been a reason for political inaction. And data really is a political necessity to get to the table sometimes. And our work aims to systematically chip away at these issues to create strategic research designs in partnership with affected communities, people affected by the problem, and we hope to play one part in shifting power. And we data report back to communities and to decision makers in lots of formats, and we think disseminating information is really central to this work, and that's where Sandy and I's partnership is really valuable. She has a visual brain and is creative and is able to take data and turn it into really great infographics, and we can show you some of those. Whereas we, sometimes just publish boring peer-reviewed papers that no one reads. So we think that it's really important to do both. Next slide. And we're really interested in the thinking about the erasure of the longstanding environmental racism, which has been normalized in some ways. And EJ struggles can be forced into really narrow frames of what you can measure and what if you can prove harm. And we think community-based research has an opportunity to design more expansive research questions and push against the limited number of options that communities are often given. And at times the research is in the background and sometimes it's in the foreground, whatever is most beneficial for the work, of social change. And we're really interested in transforming the conditions for knowledge production and, as I said, data ownership towards racial justice and focusing on interventions. So I think I might just stop there And because given the interest of time, and we can take questions, and we're going to show you some of our other work from our beauty products, kind of beauty products work, if you'd like to see it later.
It would be amazing to see the beauty products work. But first, I just wanted to quickly ask, like we did with Sandy, is there anyone who has pressing questions that they want to ask Bhavna about her section before we go into a general conversation? I'll take that long pause as a no.
No question.
Yeah, people are still processing.
I know, it's a lot of information. I feel like I just provided.
Well, maybe I'll start. So in the spirit of this being technically a reading group, I want to read a passage from your multi-authored essay, Crude Justice, that we read for today, merely just to sort of get as a conversation starter. Because a number of the topics that I want to talk about, one I had already mentioned is, making science public. What does that mean? Another one, Bhavna, that you brought up is thinking about the co-constitution or co-creation of knowledge, which I think is really important. And I think it really, really important to the practice of Beatriz da Costa, who thought about that not only in a collaborative sense with other disciplines and between a lay person and an expert, but also in a multi-species sense, which is a subject that we'll explore in the second phase of this research group in the fall. Let me read this passage. This is from page 12 of Crude Justice, and that's page 12 in the PDF, not on the page, where it's written, a benefit of utilizing low-cost sensors in community-based participatory research, in a community-based participatory research context, is that local experience, such as observations about local activities or odors, can improve interpretations of the data. On one day, nearby residents reported seeing heavy equipment in use at the active drill site. If similar methane spikes were observed every time this activity occurred, it would indicate a correlation worthy of further investigation. Examining this qualitative data alongside quantitative data provided by low-cost sensors may result in a more robust and comprehensive understanding of the community's experiences, be responsive to community concerns, and in turn carry through and inform community-based action policy recommendations. So turning to this passage, you had sort of touched upon this at the end, which is the strategies by which conversations about regulatory change are frustrated by claiming there's a lack of data or these things cannot really maybe be tested. I'm curious if you could talk a little bit first about the ways in which efforts to reform or to regulate pollutants is frustrated at the decision-making level, and how a community-based approach might remedy or work against that.
That's a good question. I think that regulatory agencies, there were 2 new wells just last week permitted in Wilmington. And so while there has been this big effort to move away from drilling to recognize that it's linked to climate change, there's also this status quo that's very hard to sometimes unravel. So regulatory agencies almost thoroughly rely on risk assessment. And risk assessment is a methodology by which you have to demonstrate that there is measurable harm and that there is some way, and if you don't take on the activity, that there's an alternative. And so it becomes very onerous on agencies to continuously prove harm on the one hand, and communities to constantly demonstrate harm. The scientific bar is so high, and it is, and agencies have become, from my experience doing this work, often very politicized. They're politicized. We have a litigious culture. People have written about this. They're worried about getting sued by industry. Industry gets an equal voice at the table. And so I think that there's lots of, just lots of inaction, because there's a fear that, if you don't have enough data, you will get sued. And so I think we need more fearless, I think, regulators that are doing some of this work. And there are some, and I won't call them out, but because they're behind the scenes. But I think there are people kind of in government who do take a stance that they can do this work. And and I think that we see lots of environmental justice problems that come from like regulatory inaction. So if anyone followed the Exide case in East LA, that's a really good example of where the agency simply failed. They let Exide operate on a temporary permit for a decade, and they were polluting lead, and now it's a lead poisoning community, right? So I think some of the problems is a lot of environmental justice communities have fought for two things. One is the precautionary principle that when you have evidence of harm, you should take action. There shouldn't be this enormous bar of endless data that we have to collect. And two, that we need to recognize there are cumulative burdens, that our agencies look at individual factories, individual facilities, they look at the pollution coming out of that one source, but haven't done as good of a job at looking at cumulative burden. And the Cal Envirus thing tool, that's a beginning step of that, right? It puts all the burdens on a map. The question then becomes, what does that mean? How does that help us take action? If we have this map now, what can it allow us to do with it, knowing where these cumulative burden sites are?
And for the community members that participated and I'm just to wrap my head around the sensors that they were using. What I understood from the essay is that what community members brought to the table was an understanding of periods in which high pollution were happening because of the rhythms of an industry that is relatively behind closed doors.
That's right. So we don't monitor near oil wells. And so by communities having access to a low-cost sensor, they can do some of their own monitoring. And the question then becomes, can we make those low-cost sensors regulatorily enforceable? And right now there's not. There's no regulatory handle that says, oh, you measured a high spike. That counts as a data point that we have this regulatory hammer to enforce. No, there are only certain kind of monitors that count. These have to be put out by the air district. And so we think that low-cost sensors have become much more sophisticated. And I think one of the next phases of struggle will be, can we make those monitors actually trigger some kind of action? Right now, they're really capacity building tools. Communities can have these low-cost sensors, they can use them, they can really gain power and learn about their air quality and environment. But when they measure something that's outside the norm, there's no way to trigger action.
Not to get too deep into the weeds and the sensors, but what literally are the sensors? Are they like small microchips? What are they?
They're like little, Sandy's used them. Do you want to talk about how they work?
Yeah, so I know like the University of Colorado Boulder came out, and there were when we placed them, we actually had to, kind of contact local residents or even businesses that would allow us to like place an air monitor around the area. So they're kind of like these lunch boxes, like heavy duty industrial, like lunch boxes, and inside they have like a little chip that you can pull out and then download the data. But man, it's been a while.
Yeah, I mean, there's also particulate monitors where you can, they are actually ones that, like, they're called purple air monitors, and you can walk around the neighborhood and measure particulate pollution, and it creates like a map for you. So if you take it out on your street, you can take a walk in your neighborhood, and and then it'll say where the pollutions, the particulates were and where they weren't. And so they're great and handy tools, and they often have a mapping device embedded in it. And lots of communities have used them around the country to measure particulate matter. A lot of the best ones are really particulate pollution, and they don't measure this huge variety of things all the time. Things like volatile organic compounds that come out of wells. Those are expensive to measure. You really need sophisticated technology because they volatilize to get them. So there's problems in things like benzene and those kinds of chemicals. In having these like personal, we don't have personal monitors for that. There's some things we can measure.
Yeah, and I think I would add that, you know, I think aside from like measuring the air quality, I think it's also a great tool for us to build that leadership because, you know, I think something that having access to those tools, I believe it was, you know, USA Environmental Health Centers, they gave us access to the Perm monitors for youth. And so they were able to carry that for like, I think a few days. They go to school, you know, and it's a way for us to build leadership. And but you know, I think it was also for them to understand how, like what Bhavna said, the cumulative impact. Here you have people who live across a freeway, their school is right under a freeway, they're living next to a drill site, you know, and so they're never escaping, you know, the air quality in communities like South LA. So it's just like this constant burden of like pollution, and you know, we're living with that our entire lives, so we can't really escape it. So it was really good for us to have access to those tools to have these conversations and build leadership.
Sandy, something that you were talking about that really struck me at the beginning is that the one of the sites was the only green space in the neighborhood, and people would use it as a recreational site, and that just really struck me. But there's a sort of a connected that, or related to that. What I thought also interesting is in building a movement to expose or to render visible this invisible, you know, health hazard. It's also rendering a community visible to itself. And maybe I was curious if you could speak a little bit about the role of not only using your artistic practice to really make a community sort of aware of itself, right, as having this sort of common plight that they were unaware of, but also building and controlling its own narrative, which you touched upon a little bit in your talk.
Sure. You know, like I mentioned, I think when we were first organizing, like I said, like even with the results of the study, you have so many folks who did not know this drilling site was in the community. And so for us, one of the initial steps was just, you know, letting folks know that there's this drilling site and this is what's going on. And so we would have like these foam heads, and we did the banner drop. And I think using popular education to build awareness was key. And I think popular education, you know, we use art. And so something that I forgot to mention is that the drilling site is actually owned by the Archdiocese of Los Angeles. So, you know, the church is like, you know, or is the owner of the land. And whenever we reached out to see if they could, you know, just for a response, they would always tell us like, you know, they can't just like terminate the leases because there's so many owners who have a stake in this oil drilling facility. And so one of the things we did, I remember a few years back, is that, you know, for the holidays, we actually had a procession. In Spanish, you call it a posada. And so pretty much we, you know, created these lyrics. We rewrote the lyrics of this song that you normally sing during the holidays, and you have a procession and you walk around the neighborhood. And so for us, again, it was just about building our presence as a movement, and then, you know, engaging people, you know, having them join us in this issue. And so yeah, you know, like Bhavna said, a lot of folks didn't even know the site is there. And I would venture to say that that's still kind of the case, just because, you know, I think University Park, we always say it's a transient community, you know, there's a lot of students, you have some longtime residents, but, you know, I think with gentrification and the colleges, you have a lot of people who come and go. And so there is this lack of awareness, you know, but yeah, you know, so I think art has always just been a way for us to yeah, build awareness, you know.
And you said, oh, sorry.
I was just reading the question that Sandy.
Oh.
Yeah. So I did, somebody, I believe Ana asked, I'm wondering if you could speak more about your coalition building with youth in South Central. Yes, that's actually important because I actually took out that slide because I didn't want to make it too long, but I did have a picture of a photo back in 2017 when we mobilized some of the kids in South Central, and they collaborated with the U of Wilmington to, sue the city of Los Angeles for one rubber stamping, pretty much giving these operators just permits to drill, and then also for the lack of protection for communities of color. And we ended up winning, and I believe the oil industry ended up suing our kids as a result. But the whole idea was that the goal was that we wanted to just really let folks know that, one, that they were not conducting environmental impact reviews when they were giving permits, and then two, that communities of color do not have the same protections. And so that was a case that we won. But recently, like Bhavna said, there was an issue in Wilmington where these operators were allowed to again operate without anybody conducting an environmental impact review. And so that's something that we a few years back we did with Gladys Limon, who was one of the attorneys at Communities for a Better Environment. And so for us, I think that when you're organizing, it's so important to build this intergenerational movement. We have women who are older, and then it's important for us to also engage the kids, because this is a long battle, and so we want to make sure that folks are constantly staying on top of this. And I think I'll give a shout out really to Communities for a Better Environment, because I feel like the work that they're doing with building youth leadership is impressive. And a lot of these kids who are part of their organization go on to work at the organization. They go on to become these leaders. And so I think the youth leadership is an important part of the movement.
I see that Jeanette has a question. Is that correct, Jeanette? You have a hand raised.
Yes, I do. Sorry, I don't know how to. Anyway, so hi, my name is Jeanette, and I work both in Los Angeles and in Houston, Texas. And my mother died from an autoimmune disease, scleroderma. We grew up right down, literally like a mile from hundreds of acres and square miles, really, of factories. It's in Pasadena, Texas. So we grew up right next to there. I'm actually here now. But, and I'm curious to know, I have had like my neighbor, he was 22. He had a crazy tumor like grown in his head, and he's dead now. So, and my mother died, and literally my next door neighbor. And so I'm wondering if you guys have done any studies on deaths, and if so, how does that number or statistic play into what you guys are doing? Or do people even think about that?
It's a good and hard question, because one of the things that I think the limitations of epidemiology and environmental health sciences really is to look at the exposure and link it to the outcome, right? And so they're really looking at how do you take an understanding of exposure and then isolate and understand the outcome. And so for oil and gas, what we see as sort of the biggest impacts that are national, right? The fracking boom, there's been a lot of studies on unconventional oil and gas. There are the best data, that most of the evidence has actually pointed to birth outcomes, like poor birth outcomes. So low birth weight babies born with impacts like spina bifida. That adverse birth outcome seems to be the most persistent and consistent outcome. So it's also, we see lung function impacts. But I think to your point for this question of, multiple impacts and vulnerabilities, some of those same questions come up in Cancer Alley, right? So in that Louisiana corridor, we see these questions of strange cancers, mortality rates. And, it's very hard to collect data that's, that sort of prove it data to say this, especially in these places where there's so many sources of pollution, making a link between one factory and the outcome is so hard. And so I think that those models really are broken, right? That we are forced to sort of have to continually demonstrate harm. And communities who live there continuously experience harm. And I would say that, so do we know whether those impacts were from those facilities? We can't know that. Right. Is it likely that there's, worse quality of life and more illness living by multiple polluting sources? Of course. And so I think the big question is, how do we move towards a better way of making decisions and changing the way agencies function, because this one is pretty broken in my opinion, but I'm sure other scientists think differently. But I think the methods we use are not sufficient to answer the question we answer all the time.
Okay, thank you very much. It's helpful.
I think there are more questions on the chat. Andrew, Beatriz Jaramillo, I think she has a question.
Let me see. Everyone forgive my technical lack of technical incompetence. Beatriz, you asked a question. Might you be able to ask it verbally? I don't see it in the chat. I'm very sorry. Unless Daniela, you see it.
Yeah, I can read it. It just say, I would like to understand better the dynamics of community participation. And I actually had a following of question related with that, because just connecting with the work of Beatriz da Costa. She were like working with for example, the pigeon blog that has monitors pollution, little backpacks in the pigeons, and they will, go and fly, and she was collecting data. I'm very interested in the idea of autonomous models and collaboration between the academia and the community. And Bhavna, you were talking about co-production of knowledge and how that happened. If you can talk more detail on that, like the community collecting the knowledge, and then the scientifics or the social scientifics interpreting, and then going back to the community, and the community using it as for action, or I think all those processes are very important. And if you both can talk in more detail about it.
That's a good question. So for a long time, the story in Los Angeles was that the data coming out of other states. So there's a lot of data on oil and gas, and there's some thousands and thousands of peer-reviewed studies that have come out. But hardly any of them are in LA. And because we use conventional drilling, so in LA you can stick a straw in the ground and oil comes out. And in other places they're fracking, right? So fracking is a different thing. You're actually shattering underground geological formations in order to bring up natural gas. And in Los Angeles, we're really drilling for oil. And the frac, it's so the methods are different. What you're trying to get is different. And so the larger narrative was that the studies actually done elsewhere won't apply. And despite any sort of peer review kind of synthesis that we would do, there was that same claim until we did that lung function study in LA, in South LA, and we could say that indeed lung function measures, they track, and then there was another big study that was done in the state of California on birth outcomes. And it also tracked, right? You see adverse birth outcomes in California too. And so I think that stand, because they were organized, they sort of could use the data to really move their, talk about disparities, include health data in their work. It wasn't the only thing they did. So I will say that this research part is kind of a small part of the work they did. It was one part. They did a lot of stuff like taking pictures of illegal violations and If they saw something operating without the community knowledge, they would photograph it. And they had a lot of tactics, the community groups. And this is really one part of that. And I think you should look at the Stand LA website. I think they tell their story really nicely. The community groups, we work really closely with them, but it's a long struggle. The other thing that I think is probably the benefit of this kind of autonomous, when you talk about like culture, that every community having to do the same thing and struggle to clothe their own wealth is really hard. And you might think about this kind of the organizing that's happening at Amazon warehouses or something, like everyone is trying to do that separately, right? So I think having a platform that stretches and stitches across communities is really valuable. And I think that level of community organizing comes from the community. And it doesn't exist in places that don't have community organization. There are definitely places like that are lacking kind of a civic and social infrastructure. And in those places, it's super hard to organize. It's hard to make change. And, I think that LA has this really great resource. And because people have struggled for so long, for decades. And so I think that it helps move every agenda because we have this infrastructure.
I think Beatriz had a question as far as like the dynamics of community participation. And I think I just wanted to briefly just mention, like as far as like when it comes to the community-based research, I think something that's at least like, when we work with, institutions like Occidental College, something that whenever we're going to work on a new study, Bhavna has always been like just on top of like, engaging like community residents or promotoras in the entire process. And so having us, participate in the design of a study, like from informing the questions to, deciding if the language is okay, how we're going to do the outreach, and then how we're going to do the report back. So there's this constant level of participation from community. And I think that's super important, in order for us to make sure that the study is efficient, that it really captures our story, but also to keep that trust with participants, because, in communities like South Central, you do have like a big immigrant population. And sometimes, people do get scared of like opening their doors or answering certain questions, giving out certain information. So I think when you have promotoras like helping lead some of this work, it definitely helps us get that data.
I have a follow-up question, again, regarding the politics of this kind of scientific research. I'm curious, and this is directed more toward Bhavna, but Sandy, maybe you also have insight into this, is whether or not as a participatory model of research becomes maybe more popular. I don't know if it is, but as it does, have you seen it have any impact in the culture of sciences in the academy?
A good question. I would say yes and no. I think that there's a lot of people want to do collaborative, community-based, cross-disciplinary research, but there's two big problems with it. The incentives are not aligned to support those goals. So that's true from things like tenure and promotion to grants to where avenues where you publish. So we can say, yeah, we love community-based research, but then if you don't publish a peer-reviewed paper and you publish a report instead, that doesn't count, right, for your tenure and promotion. So I think that there's the incentives and the goals are not well aligned. And I think that until they are, there will be really big challenges in doing effective community-based research. And I think that is, on the other hand, it's changing kind of slowly, but it's changing. But I do think that a lot of I'm at a small college, a small liberal arts college, and I think a lot of big R1 universities are positioned to sort of amass resources in a way that small colleges are not, small community organizations are not, and that is a continual challenge, I think. I think for anyone doing community-based work, because I think if you are at a big institution, you do one small thing and you have a press release, right? And so if you're kind of slogging it out on the ground and you don't have a media presence, people don't know you're doing that work, the credit goes elsewhere. And so it's kind of a really sort of a cycle of challenges that I find that are continual, but I think until the incentives align with the goals, it's going to be a hard thing.
Are there any follow-up questions? I don't know if any came into the chat.
We can show you some of our beauty products work. If that's interesting to folks. I mean, that's a whole other project, so we don't need to talk about all of it, but I can show you some of our materials.
Well, before you pivot, Hillary Mushkin has a question. I see.
Hi. Hi, everybody. Nice to see some friends on here. Anyway, I'm sorry because I missed some of this at the beginning. And hang on one second, excuse me. But I do have a question because a lot of what you're saying resonates with frustrations that I am very aware of. And I wondered about, so like this thing about the data being the sort of fundamental authoritative evidence, you know, and then sort of what the, like, you know, talking about how high the bar is for sort of having evidence that is suitable for supporting legal arguments, I guess, which I totally understand, you know, because I guess going back to the question earlier, this is, I think, from Jeanette about, you know, rates of cancer, for example, or deaths, and how, you know, prevalent they are, but yet that, you know, when you're in these kinds of situations where there's many different potential environmental factors, it's not, you know, to prove that it's one or the other actor is a very, it's like, you know, we see this all over the place. It's like, not just in LA, it's like a almost impossible, you know, it's so rare to be able to do that. And I guess, you know, I was thinking a little bit about like what the, how there's this disconnect between what people experience and know and what the law prioritizes, I guess. And I think, I guess I wondered about like where, if there's any play, like wiggle room there, you know, for something else. I mean, that's a very, I realize that that's like a pie in the sky idea, but I'm just putting it out there. Yeah. For either of you guys.
I mean, I'm sure Sandy has some idea of what she would, how she would think about this, but I think that between affected communities and inactive regulatory agencies is shaming industry. And that really is one of the ways in which there has been effective movement. It's not complete movement. I think industries are huge global capital, you know, machines, and they're very hard to pin down, but there has been some effective spaces that have done that well. So I think those kinds of creative tactics are sometimes effective, but it's true. I mean, maybe there are this range of options into, you know, what do you ask for between when we have a better system and where we are now, and that has seemed to be sort of market-based.
Yeah, I think like for me, you know, like I'm always using storytelling, you know, and I think like storytelling and art could play a role in this, especially now with like, you know, in the age of like social media and just artists and like art. I feel like we have like this resurgence of just like art, you know, and the potential and the impact it can have. And I feel like, you know, even like Bhavna said, if shaming industry, how do you do that? Well, through storytelling, through art, through, I don't know, so I feel like, you know, social media art is a great way of exposing people, and I feel like that puts pressure on folks. So I think that could be an avenue.
Actually, can I just ask a quick follow-up question? Because I feel like maybe this is, I think that totally rings true, you know, what you're saying. And I guess I'm wondering about like, historically, if we can think about other situations where that tactic worked, I'm sure there must be some, and I'm wondering if any come to mind, in, like for you. Yeah.
Well, I think that there is, you know, on the oil side, what's interesting is the Jefferson drill site is a good example. They're closing down, they're trying to dismantle their field. They're in South LA. And they were sued by Earth Justice for not having tall walls and any sort of the noise protection that you could see in Beverly Hills and other city areas that have wells. And so they were sued for to be able to have to put up those same protective equipment, the kind of infrastructure that would support the same kind of protections. And rather than do that, they decided to shut down. And so it clearly was paying the pollute, and it was clearly not effective to put in some of those. So I think that is one strategy that, you know, was effective. That, you know, instead of saying shut down, you said, you know, the community really asked for an equitable approach to drilling in their community, and that I think revealed this facade of that. Okay, well, we don't want to pay for that. In kind of our product-based work, some of the market pressures around companies that sell things with bisphenol A and those kinds of, you know, consumer product kind of efforts, companies sometimes do take out chemicals that are of harm. It's not perfect because they come back in a form that you might not expect. But I think that it's there's like these unintended consequences sometimes, but there has been effective consumer product efforts that I think there's lots of.
Maybe that would be a good point to transition into the current work you're doing, which I think is really important and very interesting.
Anna had her hand up. Did you?
Oh, I'm sorry. Did I overlook somebody?
You did. No, I'm kidding. Well, I did have a follow-up question actually to what we were just discussed, as Bhavna and Sandy were reflecting on strategies and tactics, and Sandy brought up art as a tactic essentially, and it reminded me of something that Sandy said earlier about being very green to the oil drilling movement and the activism in Los Angeles and just everywhere else on just essentially being a non-expert in that field, and also an artist, not an activist, but an artist and community organizer, not an expert in the field essentially. And so a lot of connections, obviously, I think came to mind for those that are part of our study group, have been thinking about this idea of being a non-expert, an artist, not a scientist, and dealing with these issues. And I guess this is partly a comment slash kind of larger, more open-ended question, because I know we have a lot of artists here in the room right now. And so I'm wondering, from your artistic perspective, or as somebody in the arts, a curator, an art worker, what you see as a strategy or tactic to combat environmental racism, environmental justice, to promote environmental justice, or other issues that you are concerned with. What are some of the tactics that you personally embody or deploy, or just in general, what kind of power the arts may have in addressing these kinds of issues? And I know that's a very open-ended question, but obviously I think something that inspires us all for we are here today. So I just wanted to throw that out there.
Sure. You know, I think like for me, like I said, like you said, I definitely don't consider myself like an artist. Like, I think it took me a while to even say that, or even a filmmaker or anything like that. But I think because I've always just used the art to create accessibility, you know, I think that has always been my goal. It's like to bring about social change and create access. Because like Bhavna said, a lot of this research is data, you know, folks are not going to go and read an article or a journal. Some might, you know, but as far as like my community, I don't think a lot of us will. And for me, it's like I said, I was telling Andrew earlier, you know, it's always about making research sexy and accessible. You know, it's like, how do I make it pretty so that people actually consume it? How do I, you know, what language am I going to use, you know, so that people actually understand this? And so for me, I think that's why I just never consider myself an artist. I'm just more like, yeah, just trying to make it accessible for folks and trying to bring about social change in my community. But I definitely feel like art is a way to do that. And I do that through through film. I do that through spoken word. I do have a poem that I did a long time ago on like the oil drilling, and it really captures the impact in our communities. And maybe I'll send that video to you all after. And then infographics, again, infographics are really the something that I focus on a lot. And it just happened, you know, out of necessity, you know. And I guess when I create, it's not because like, oh, I'm going to create something pretty and I'm going to, you know, I want to be an artist. It's more of like, you know, it's out of necessity. And so, yeah, and we'll get to see some of those infographics next, but thank you for the question. I appreciate that.
I will say that her art, I know she's an artist and I'm not, because I cannot do the things that she does. I can't even really conceptualize turning data into the beautiful sorts of formats she does. So I think that it's really important actually for scientists or scholars to think a little bit more about how to communicate their work, because it's super siloed and very ineffective. And we know that from the COVID pandemic, right? That there's been just like scientists are very poor communicators. And so I think that we could really benefit from better collaboration with artists who are much better communicators and have, are able to kind of access people's emotions and other parts of our bodies and brains that I think scientists are not always good at. So I suppose I think about it that way. How do we create better collaborative spaces? Because I don't think we have good ones, really. Even the funding is siloed, right? There's it's just I think maybe Beatriz was thinking a lot of this. I can show you we can show you a little bit of our taking stock study. You'll see that. Can you make that bigger? So tiny.
It looks fine on my end, but I'm not sure if it looks small.
Maybe is it small on anyone else's end? It's tiny on mine, but maybe I can just ignore that so everyone else can see it. So I will. Let's see. Oh yeah, maybe it works. Okay, so you can go back. All right, so I'm gonna just can you go back 1 slide, 2 slides? Okay, so one of the things that we've thought about for environmental justice issues that are a big problem that no one really contends with and haven't for a long time are consumer products. And our work on environmental justice, I've worked on environmental justice for 20 years and really looked at place-based exposures. And we are interested in and really working on, and this is an active study that where our data is still new, not like the oil drilling work that's kind of more wrapped up in more naming in a bow. But this question of what is the story of consumer product exposures and how do we fit into the environmental justice landscape? Next slide. So the important kind of policy problem. So I sit in a policy department, and all of my questions are really thinking about a policy dilemma. And really the policy problem here is that consumer products are unregulated. You think that when you go into Rite Aid or Walgreens or Target and you buy something, most people think that there is they've been tested, but that's not true. There are 80,000 chemicals in commerce, and most of these are unregulated. The Toxic Substances Control Act was passed in 1976, and they grandfathered in 60,000 chemicals, and most of these, which means that they were just brought in without any testing. So there's little pre-market testing, no enforcement, and the burden of proof is on consumers to prove harm. On top of that, fragrances are a trade secret. They're protected by trade secrets, and so you can't know what's in them. So fragrances are kind of at the core of something that we're very concerned about. So we worry a lot about is in the Taking Stock study, are really thinking about, it's okay, we can just keep going. That's fine. Is the Taking Stock study. So what do we know? We know that there's been lots of illnesses that are documented in that are linked with consumer products. We also know that women of color are disproportionately exposed to consumer product chemicals. So there is something called the Centers for Disease Control actually measures chemicals in the US population. They measure 212 different chemicals, and so we know what's in people. And we know that Black women and Latinas, Hispanic populations have higher levels of what we see as consumer product chemicals. And these are some of the phthalates and parabens that are in consumer products. And these chemicals have been associated with these with uterine fibroids, reproductive harm, breast cancer. So the problem here is that we have all these downstream measures, but we get the data gap of, well, we don't know what women are using. We don't know that these illnesses come from consumer products, and there's no data documenting product use. So it's a pretty far upstream problem, and it seems like kind of a simple thing to do is look at what people are using, but that's what we're doing. So that's the Taking Stock study. We have a website. It's an ongoing study, and it's in South LA. Next. So we have done kind of a lot of work through the study, and these are some of the infographics that we've made through our work. And we did a survey. So on the very far left, you'll see the data from our survey. Did you have the AIMS page in this?
Let me actually pull it up on this. Sorry, I just try to shorten this one, but
no, it's okay. We don't actually have to go through all of it. It's very,
I can.
But if you have this,
Yeah.
you can just,
Let's see. Let me actually share this. Sorry.
let me share my screen.
One second.
Okay. So if you go back, one more. Okay, all right, okay, so this is our team. This is our big study team of this project, and it's kind of an ongoing study. And and if you want to know more about it, we can, are happy to kind of share more offline, but it's a big collaborative between Black Women for Wellness, which is a statewide organization, and they work nationally on reproductive health and environmental justice. Oxy, George Washington University, which is soon to be Columbia University, Silent Spring Institute, which is a research think tank in Massachusetts. They're focused on women's health exposures, and LA Grant Media, which is Sandy's organization. So we're kind of a big team. Next slide. And we have a community advisory board as well. So this study is really two big parts with these three aims, and this is how we kind of describe our study. One, we did this statewide survey in the state of California, looking at what women use across race and ethnicity. So we surveyed 600 people, and the survey closed right before the pandemic started. So in March 2020, so all of our data is pre-pandemic. The second part of the study is we actually created an app because we wanted to know what people are using. And we use Silent Spring has an app called Detox Me, which you can download and use on your own on your smartphone. But we modified it for the Taking Stock study. And in the second part of the study, which is a community-based portion, we actually had 70 women, 35 Black women, 35 Latinas living in South LA, use the barcode scanner from the app and scan all the products in their house for a week. And at the end of the week, they gave us a urine sample so we could see what was in their bodies. And then we tested some of the products that they're using. So the next slide. So we, on our survey, we actually published this data so we can send it to you if you would like, but we looked at women across the state of California. And one of the things I'd like to just point out is that a lot of people are multiracial, and we didn't put them in one or other of the bucket. And I think that's the thing we need to do better in research, is actually characterize exposures for multiracial populations, because more and more of our populations are multiracial. Next slide. And so what did we find in the statewide survey? That people used about 8 products a day, and someone used about 30 products every day. So people are using lots of products. Next slide. And we also found differences by race and ethnicity. So one of the things that I'll point out is for douching products, menstrual intimate products, Black women use far more. So we know that douching products, vaginal products, are actually not encouraged by OBGYNs, but there's a lot of racism and odor discrimination. There's a history of it. We've written about this in a paper called The Environmental Injustice of Beauty. And so we see some of this impact in Black women. We saw that Latinas use far more cosmetics than other women. Asian women actually were right behind, so next slide, right behind Black women in the number of hair products that they use, in hair straightening products. But here's the intimate product graph, so you'll see that Black participants were far more likely to use vaginal douches. White respondents were far more likely to say they use vaginal lubricants. So there are differences in product use. And I know that seems kind of basic, but we didn't really document that before. Like, what does it mean to have differences in product use? Next slide. And this is just the same slide. It's showing it another way, really showing you the number and variety of products that are out on the market. There's a huge number, and products that we actually never heard of show up, but things people use. So, and the menstrual cup was an interesting one. White women use it far more than other women. And also true of tampons. So there are differences. We don't know why. We didn't get into that question. Next slide. This is hair products, and I'll just, on the very far right, you'll see that hair perm and relaxer, actually Asian women use quite a lot of it, which we wouldn't have, we didn't know before we did this study. So while it's less than other things, it's actually right near how many Black, how much hair straightener Black women use. Next slide. So this is another way to look at like all the different products that we have. Next. So this is how we report. So this paper had a ton of data, and it was really hard to read, and it was behind a paywall, and no one wanted to read the statistics. So this is an infographic that we published from this paper. And this is, I think, a good example of the kind of work Sandy does. What did we learn? What is a punchline? And what are the things that, we can kind of move forward and show to like decision makers? If we give them the paper, what might they also have? And one of the things that we think is important is that 70% of women prefer scented versions of the products they use. And since fragrance is this umbrella term that may contain dozens of undisclosed and unregulated chemicals, this was a data point that we lifted up. And so this is, I think, a good example of the way that Sandy makes our work much more compelling. And instead of giving people who participated who said they wanted the data, we gave them, if they wanted a study, we gave that to them. If they wanted kind of just the synthesis, we could give them this. Next slide. So the community science days, which we're still crunching the data for, and also kind of because we're running out of time. We use this app, and women scan their product for a week. And we actually have a video that we created, a video tutorial, because the pandemic hit, and this was supposed to be this door-to-door study where we worked with women in their houses, but we ended up, so Sandy made a video, and I don't know if this link works, but Sandy made a video to help onboard our participants, and that was hugely useful because I don't think we could have done it otherwise. Does that link work, Sandy? Okay, we're gonna watch the first quick 1 minute. You have to share your audio of the video. Sandy.
Sandy, you'll have to share screen again and click audio when you share screen.
Sorry, can you hear Bhavna? Or
No, I can't hear it. So you have to
Okay.
share your audio.
Okay, so you said,
So
sorry.
just try resharing your screen. So exit and then try again, and then click on the left-hand side at the bottom.
Okay, got okay.
Talk about expertise. That's some Zoom expertise right there.
When you teach class online.
Yeah, I don't know.
While we're working out the AP, very
Oh yeah, that works.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
My name is Jan Robinson Flint. I'm the Executive Director of Black Women for Wellness. Thank you for taking part in our Taking Stock study. The Taking Stock study is a community-driven research project. We have partners. It's Black Women for Wellness, it's Occidental College, Silent Spring Institute, LA Grit, and the most important part of this project is you as our community. So we're looking at how Black and brown women use chemicals. What are those products that we use are toxic chemicals, and how those products impact our health. The average person uses 26 products every day. This is just my walking around stuff. I didn't bring the bathroom with me, but we use a lot of products. So what we're asking you to do is scan in your products, your lip gloss, your lipstick, your hair care. Thank you so much for participating in our study because it couldn't be done without you. And it's important because we need to know about our health and well-being.
Just let it go for the first second.
The first drop-down menu. Next, enter your unique.
But then there were
ID
instructions,
and press
which I
on
think
submit.
were
Press
okay.
allow.
Yeah.
You are now.
Come out of it. So we had to pivot because of the pandemic and move towards this online model of outreach. We would call participants, and then once they were onboarded, you want to go back to the presentation? We would then give them access to the video. And then I'm just going to show you some of what we have learned so far. We're still parsing through some of the data. Let's see. Yeah, sure. Sorry. Do all the work. If you scroll to, oh yeah, so go back one. So if you go back one slide. Yeah, okay, so here's our community. We Black and women and Latinas. You'll note though that we can't compare these populations because our Black participants came largely from BWW and they largely had a professional degree and other degree. And we think because of our recruitment method, it just created a skew because a lot of women who are already interested in their products are already coming to BWW to learn about them. And then Sandy recruited our Latinas. So, and they're much more diverse across educational levels. But you'll see that, and they all live in South LA, all of our participants. Next slide. So what did we learn? We learned that 70 women actually use about 11 products a day. And they scanned 1,600 different products. So this is a huge number of products used by 70 women, and we thought we might find some sort of commonality. So one type of deodorant that seemed much more common, or one type of lotion that was used by multiple users, but there was almost no overlap in the products that people used. And so sunscreen, 33 brands, 25 were used by 25 users. 31 women used 37 brands of all-purpose cleaner. 17 women used 27 brands of body oil. 17 women used 21 brands of curl cream and leave-in conditioner. So what is a problem here is that we have a really big problem in alternative switching. There's very little transparency in the market when there's a problem product. If someone gets a rash or something is seen by industry as being problematic, they simply take it off the shelf and put a different product with a different name. So, you know, Dove Irish scent or whatever will become Dove, you know, palm scent or something. It'll just still change the name and it'll be a different product. And so it's very hard as women try to avoid products, chemicals and products, move towards alternative. There's very little market transparency, and I think this is a good space for some sort of intervention. Next. And we also did focus groups, and this is with all of our participants, and really we're interested in what's driving product use. And so women really talked about, like, from their early life, what led them to use the products that they used. And so one example is someone who was in the military, and it was either they get in line or they get out of the military, and straight hair meant being polished. And so we're really thinking about what are the upstream drivers of product use. Sandy, I'm gonna have you move to the infographic. Yeah, right here. So over this study, which we're still collecting data, we'll be publishing over the next year. Some of our data, we'll put out more infographics, but we're really found that fragrance products were hard to avoid, where people use lots of products. We did test their urine data, and I think that we found lots of these consumer product chemicals in all the women. And if you're interested, I can share some of that with you. I think we might have a slide for that. Here it is. So this is how many chemicals were detected in our participants. So there were about 28 chemicals, and including phthalates and phenols, which are really fingerprints of consumer product exposure. And what we're doing now is really trying to compare our women to the general population of the US and the state of California. Next slide.
Bhavna, if I may jump in and be mindful of time, we have just a few minutes left, and I wanted to just quickly ask the group if there's anyone who has a final question they'd like to quickly ask our guests. If you do, please speak so now.
I think Lauren has a question on the chat. I don't know if you want to read it, Lauren.
Yeah.
I just got a response privately, so thank you so much for calling attention. Thank you, Daniela.
I want to echo Lauren's question, though, what I believe it was the question. If anyone has any interest in Bhavna and Sandy's work, Bhavna and Sandy, is there a way that they might reach out to you? Is there a good way for them to connect with either of you?
They can email us. I don't know. That's my email. And I think Sandy, I don't know if you have a communicating. But we have, a lot of our data is online. You can go to the Taking Stock study. Sorry, that is a very long study and there's tons of data. So I think, but one of the things that we're interested in is, people who are interested in this work and want to maybe be doing better thinking around consumer product labeling. We're always happy to work with. And those are the big coalition that's working on this question of beauty justice And the Nail Salon Collaborative is about to have a big conference, I think, next week or 2 weeks from now. So there's lots of organizations doing this work. But yeah, you should go to takingstockstudy.org to see some of their videos.
Well, we're at 2:59, which is officially 2 hours. So I want to thank again Bhavna and Sandy for presenting to us their really important and really interesting work. So if everyone could just join me again in thanking them. And this has been fabulous. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
And for those of you who are in our collective reading group, as you know, there will be one final session, which will be a bit more casual than the ones that we've had before. And I will be sending a follow-up email in the next few days regarding that. So Bhavna and Sandy, thank you again. This has been really fantastic. And everyone have an excellent rest of your weekend. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.